Let's dive into one of history's most incredible stories. We're going all the way back to 73 BC, to a time when one man, a warrior who was forced into slavery, lit a fire that almost burned the Roman Republic to the ground. This is the story of Spartacus.
Just think about those words for a second. That's a man with his back against the wall, facing impossible odds. The story goes that right before his last battle, Spartacus actually killed his own horse in front of his men. The message was crystal clear. There's no running away, there's only victory or death.
So, how did a man get to a point like that? To really get the rebellion, you have to understand the man, and you have to understand the absolutely brutal world that made him. His journey wasn't just some fall from grace. It was a straight-up descent into hell.
Now here's the thing you got to know about Spartacus. He wasn't born a slave. He was a free man, a trained warrior from Thrace, a region known for its fierce fighters. He was actually forced into the Roman army as an auxiliary soldier. But he deserted, and when he was caught, Rome decided his skills were better suited for entertainment. He was sold into slavery, and his life took its darkest possible turn.
He ended up in a gladiatorial school. They called it a ludus, in a city called Capua. And life there, wow. It was just a non-stop cycle of savage training and fighting to the death, all for a cheering crowd. Inside those walls, you were less than human. You were property. But it was right there, in that pit of absolute despair, that the first tiny sparks of rebellion started to glow.
And those sparks, well, they were about to become an absolute inferno. What started as just a desperate plan to escape was about to become a full-blown crisis for the most powerful republic on Earth. This wasn't just a riot. It was the birth of an army.
It all kicked off with this unbelievably gutsy prison break. About 78 gladiators, with Spartacus leading the charge, basically decided they'd rather die fighting for their freedom than live one more day for their masters. They literally fought their way out with kitchen tools, got lucky and seized a cart full of actual weapons and armor, and then made a run for the high ground on Mount Vesuvius. And this is where you see the first real flash of Spartacus's military genius. Rome sends 3,000 soldiers, not even a real legion, just militia, thinking they can easily trap the small band on the volcano. They guard the only road down. So what does Spartacus do? He has his men make ropes out of wild vines, they rappel down a sheer cliff face that the Romans thought was impossible to descend, and they completely blindside the Roman camp from behind. It was an absolute slaughter.
So let's just pause on that for a second. This whole thing started with just 78 men. 78 highly trained, desperate gladiators who just refused to die in chains.
But after that unbelievable victory at Vesuvius, word spread like wildfire. Suddenly, escaped slaves, poor farmers, shepherds, anyone with a grudge against Rome started flocking to their banner. Their numbers exploded to 70,000. This wasn't a band of runaways anymore. This was a real army.
And with this new massive army, Spartacus starts marching north. He actually defeats 2 proper Roman legions sent against him. The ultimate prize, freedom, was right there. It was almost within their grasp. But then, they had to make a choice.
I mean, can you imagine this moment? After crushing Roman armies, Spartacus had marched his people the entire length of Italy, and right in front of them are the Alps, the gateway out of Roman territory. The path to freedom, to a new life, was wide open. And this is the great tragedy of the whole story. With safety right there in front of them, they made a decision that would seal their fate. They turned around. They marched back south, toward Rome.
So what happened? Well, it really boiled down to this. Spartacus, the general, he knew the only real victory was to get over those mountains and disappear. But his army, you have to remember who these people were. They were fueled by years, decades of rage and bitterness. They didn't just want freedom. They wanted revenge. They wanted to burn it all down. They voted to stay and plunder Italy, and Spartacus had to go along with them.
And that choice, that turn back south, it changed everything. They weren't going to be fighting clumsy militias anymore. Oh no. Now, they were about to face the full, organized, and absolutely bottomless fury of the Roman war machine.
The Roman Senate was now in a full-blown panic. So they turned to one man, Marcus Crassus. He was the richest man in Rome, and he was ambitious, cold, and utterly ruthless. He was given command of 8 legions, and basically a blank check to do one thing: end this. To understand Crassus, you have to know that his first move wasn't against Spartacus, it was against his own men. His legions were demoralized, so he brought back this ancient, terrifying form of punishment called decimation. When one of his units broke and ran, he had the survivors draw lots, and every 10th man was beaten to death by his own friends. The message was simple: you will fear me more than you fear the enemy.
Then, Crassus pulled off this just mind-boggling feat of military engineering. He trapped Spartacus's whole army in the toe of Italy, and then he built a wall, a ditch, and a rampart, 60 kilometers long, from one side of the coast to the other. He wasn't planning on fighting them. He was going to seal them in and starve them into submission.
And you'd think that would be it, right? Trapped. But no. In a last incredible act of defiance, Spartacus and his army actually broke through Crassus's wall during a winter storm. But it was just a temporary escape. They were finally cornered, with no options left. They had to make their last stand.
Because they escaped one trap only to find themselves in an even bigger one. Crassus was coming up from behind them, and now another famous Roman general, Pompey the Great, was landing with his legions to the north. They were caught in a pincer. There was absolutely nowhere left to run.
In that final battle, the ancient historians say that Spartacus fought like a cornered lion. He tried to personally fight his way through thousands of Roman soldiers just to get to Crassus. He was wounded in the thigh, fought on one knee, but he just kept going until he was completely surrounded and cut down. His body was so torn apart in the fighting that it was never found.
So the rebellion was over. The army was destroyed. But for Rome and for Crassus, that still wasn't enough. They needed to make a lesson out of this, an eternal lesson.
Crassus took 6,000 survivors captive after that final battle. And for them, a quick death on the battlefield would have been a kindness. He had all 6,000 of them crucified along the Appian Way, the main road leading back to Rome. Across every 30 meters or so for 200 kilometers. It was a billboard of pure terror, stretching all the way from where the rebellion began, right to the gates of Rome. The message was brutal and clear. This is what happens when slaves dream of being free.
So, did Spartacus fail? I mean, by any military definition, yes, of course. His army was completely wiped out. And yet, his story, the story of the gladiator who took on an empire, it just refused to die. He became more than a man. He became an idea, an undying symbol for anyone fighting against oppression. And it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What really defines victory?